Is dinner almost ready?
Yeah, almost. I'm setting the table right now.
Oh, Mom, you know what's been happening at uni recently?
No, tell me about it.
I'm not even allowed to enter without my student ID anymore.
You're not?
No, every time I go to class, I have to show it, and I'm not even allowed in the university without it.
Oh, that's strange.
Apparently, there were like a load of protests while I was abroad on exchange, something to do with the conflict in Israel.
Yeah, I heard about it on the news.
Yeah, it's all over social media.
The Israeli military has killed at least 104 Palestinians. Nearly 700 people are injured, dozens in critical condition. More than 30,000 Palestinians have now been killed since Israel began its war on Gaza in October.
It is getting worse. The bombing increased and increased. Because of this, people are running, people are escaping to the south. There's no food or water or clean water.
We tried so hard, and we're still fighting.
One look online and you will find it. Countless of social media posts regarding the conflict in the Gaza region in Israel. Another escalation of the century-old Palestine-Israel conflict. The main actors? The terrorist organization Hamas and the Israeli government. The victims? Innocent civilians. October 7th, 2023 marks the start of the most recent escalation of violence in the region. Since then, around 1,100 Israelis and over 33,000 Palestinians have been killed. Before we can go into this discussion, a little context is probably necessary. It is an incredibly complex conflict, so we are going to attempt to explain its history as clearly as possible in the time we've been given. So let's begin at the beginning. When did it all start? There's a lot of debate about this, but to keep it feasible, we will start at the end of the First World War in 1917. Britain and France ended up in the possession of a big piece of the Middle East after winning the war. They divide the territory, and Britain ends up creating the country Palestine with the Balfour Accords. This agreement openly promises that Palestine is now the national home for the Jews and states that Britain will help them relocate. The Jewish population had been wanting to escape Europe due to increasing anti Semitism. Zionism also increased, which is the belief that Judaism is more of a nationality than a religion and that Jews have the right to live in their religious homeland. Since Palestine had so much religious significance, it made sense for them to move here. As more Jews start to move into their newly appointed home, tensions arise between the local Arab population and the Jews. In the 1930s, the Arab population started to revolt, and the British slammed this resistance down with brute force. But as the tension continues to arise, the British realize that in order to maintain peace, compromises need to be made. However, no one seemed to be able to agree to anything. When the Second World War occurred in 1940, Nazi Germany committed genocide now known as the Holocaust, killing an estimated 6 million Jews and forcing many more to move. The population of Palestine thus has increasingly more Jews, and the United Nations decided to step in. They come up with a plan where the Jewish would get their own state, called Israel. The Palestinians would remain independent, and Jerusalem would become an international zone. Britain would leave the region entirely. The Jewish agreed, however, the Palestinians, the Arabs, did not. The offer was worse than what Britain had initially promoted, and the Palestinians refused to give up land in general. Regardless of the dismay of the Palestinians, Israel declared itself a new state in 1948.
So, actually, the British made a promise to the Jewish people that they could have their own country called Palestine. And later on, the UN, after, of course, the horrible Holocaust happened, they decided to split Palestine in half to try reduce tensions in the region without thinking of the people who had already been living there, the Arabs.
Yeah, that's right.
So, if I'm correct, Israel now is just its own state.
Well, Israel declared itself its own state. However, neighboring countries did not agree. They all invade Palestine and fight with Israel, but they lose. So now Palestine no longer exists at all. Egypt takes over the territory of Gaza, and Jordan takes over a territory of the West Bank. But many Arabs flee with the intention to return after the war, which Israel then prohibits. The Jews now have their own states after years of being killed and chased out, but the Arab population now has nothing. The war was over, but tensions still exist.
Mhm.
In 1967, Israel decides to attack its neighboring countries. The Six-Day War is won by Israel, and they have control over Gaza, the West Bank, and part of Egypt now. The United Nations classifies from 1967 onwards these as occupied territories. Having lost another war, the neighboring countries realize that they are not going to win it when it comes to their military. This results in the movement of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. They attempt to resist the Israeli presence in a different manner. They attack different Israeli objectives and end up killing Israelis in the process in a terrorist or as a terrorist organization. They lose influence in the 1980s, which allows for the rise of Hamas. Hamas is even more extreme, and they believe the PLO to be too secular and too compromise minded. Around this time, we see the revolt called the First Intifada, an Arabic word for uprising, which was heavily beat down by Israel.
Well, I remember the news in the 80s about the PLO and Arafat, who was the face and spokesman of this organization. And at that time, a lot of us were inclined to support Israel, since the only thing that was highlighted were the terrorist attacks by the PLO. And there were some who spoke up for the rights of the Palestinians, but, well, you can say they were overshadowed.
Well, in 1993, we do see one of the first attempts to solve the conflicts. The president of Israel and the president of the PLO come to an agreement called the Oslo Accords, with the president of the United States acting as a mediator. But since this was not backed by the populations, the accords fell through. The Israeli president was killed by an Orthodox Jewish student, which goes to show that extremists on both sides use violence to derail peace.
I remember that. I was really shocked when I believe his name was called Rabin, who was killed then, and it was truly a shock to us because we were so close to make those peace arrangements, and then suddenly we were further away than ever.
Well, after this tension continues to arise, the West Bank starts to see many Jewish settlements establishing themselves, which is actually considered illegal, but they are backed by the Israeli government with monetary and military support. And while Gaza was left alone by the Israeli government, Hamas was elected to lead the region. With the terrorist organization leading the area, Israel has cut off Gaza completely from the outside world, resulting in unemployment, poverty, water and electricity shortages, and hunger. No one can leave, and both Hamas and Israel continue to attack each other. Now, that was a whole pill to swallow, and I've left quite a lot of information out of it, but this should provide us enough context to talk more in depth about the ceasefire negotiations.
I think so. So, before we start with the soup and the potatoes, could you tell me something more about those ceasefire negotiations?
Sure. So, the news agency Al Jazeera has recently published an article on the 30th of March talking about the Gaza truce talks and the protests of the Israeli population towards their president. It seems as if the population of Israel is ready to negotiate with Hamas to retrieve the captives, and they believe that the Israeli President Netanyahu is obstructing this. Another article, published by news agency The National on April 6th, said the ceasefire agreement is backed by the United States, which marks a change in their rhetoric. Present at the negotiations will be CIA Director William Burns, along with mediators from Egypt and Qatar, as well as a delegation of Hamas and of Israel. Hamas declared the following non negotiables: a full cessation of the aggression, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and the return of the displaced people and a serious prisoner exchange deal.
Okay, let's have that conversation then, my
That's our
dear.
conversation.
Yeah. It's,
Um,
I think it's a very difficult situation. To be honest, first when I told you about the 80s, 90s, maybe also, we were really inclined to be more pro-Israel. Although I remember when I was discussing, I had a discussion about this with my dad, and he was kind of pro-Israel. And I had a history lesson about the Palestinians, and at that history lesson, we were told about oppression and and that the people had to suffer and that their land was taken away from them. And I know my dad said something like, "Well, it turns out that you're becoming half of a of a Palestine or something like that." Like it was something uh, not good to be, there's something wrong. Okay, okay. Um, Actually, we stopped this discussion because it led to nothing. And now, after the years have passed and more information is getting out, more information also about oppression of the Palestinians, and the news goes beyond only the terrorist attacks by the PLO and now Hamas. There is more understanding why the Palestinians are taking these measures, or ask yeah ask, for example, Hamas, if it's asking to step in and to help, because um, they have no other options.
Yeah.
They suffered so much, nobody helps them. uh, there were negotiations, I believe, before, as with Rabin, right, the president at that time, the prime minister at that time. But then the right wing of the Israeli government came into power, and then everything stopped, and they have no future anymore. So I do understand where they're coming from. But and I can understand what Hamas is asking at the negotiations, that that aggression has to stop, the Israeli have to withdraw, prisoner exchange, etc. But I think first what has to happen is that the Israeli will get a new government, that the government of Netanyahu will fall, and I hope that a lot of people, a lot of Israelis will protest against the government, so that in the end, there is no other option than to write out new elections, so that a new government will be there, and that these changes can actually happen. In between, in the time in between, I hope there will be a ceasefire, so that the Palestinian people in the Gaza, they can take they can breathe again, and try to, I mean, to settle down a bit, that the dust will settle, and that they get some relief. Although if you see the pictures and the videos from that area, they're I mean, they're almost completely diminished already.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's also interesting to kind of look at it from a different perspective, because when you talk about you being younger, and how the image of Palestinians and Israel was back then, with social media, we've gotten this whole new perspective of the other side as like living in the West and living
True.
in the Netherlands. I think it's interesting how that has kind of shifted in our population in general, because what I've been noticing is that there's quite a dichotomy between the government ID and the population ID. Like what the population thinks and what the governments are saying is quite different, I think.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, maybe also now with the upcoming social media playing a more important role, the world is becoming smaller and smaller. Then when my dad said at that time, uh, I was in doubt. Like I heard what the teacher in the history lesson was telling us about what happened, but then my dad said about the Israelis, and that the Palestine, the PLO, for example, was doing those terrible things. Then we also were inclined to think, okay, well, when you say that, we will listen. We were more uh, we would follow whatever the government was telling us,
Yeah.
more than what's happening now. Now, because of all the news that's coming to us, we can, if it's of course verified news. I mean, there's also it can be a lot of fake news. I know that, but you can form a better how you say that, defined opinion about what is happening.
I think also, especially because now you've got like TikTok and whatever, and all these clips of like
Yeah,
actually seeing the violence and what's happening to people in Gaza. And I think that's kind of what creates this whole shift in opinion, is the fact that you can see all these images and clips of it actually happening. Like there's no, it isn't fake. Like you can physically see it.
yeah, and I do hope that, talking about the negotiations, about what is going on, that I think the politics and the governments have a kind of a hidden agenda. I mean, there's more going on than the public knows, even with the
For
social
sure.
media, things that we don't know, reasons why the US supported Israel. Of course, they are known, but there's still more going on. But you can see a shift now.
It's because I think recently the US has been getting a lot of um negative uh like negative uh feedback from like the people and whatever, that they're supporting Israel and they're supporting the Israeli government, which is why I think Joe Biden has said like if Israel doesn't stop um, their aggression towards Gaza right now, then we're gonna switch our position. And it's because of all that negative information, like negative feedback that they've gotten, that I think they've switched their position. Because in the end, like no matter how deeply rooted the relations with Israel are, they have an image to maintain as like as a respectful country, you know. So
Yeah, of
it's,
course,
I
they
think
do.
that plays a role too.
Yeah, and then maybe because of the social media, that these negotiations now can happen, and with another kind of yeah, that they will listen to the public opinion, that it plays a kind of a part that's of also pro Palestinians, and all the things that are happening there, that also the governments, they cannot turn, how do you say that, a blind eye to it. So they have to take that into consideration, and that this cannot longer continue. So Hamas, with their non-negotiables that they have, I'm not sure if it can happen straight away, right away, especially with the Israeli
Hmm.
right-wing government right now. But if they are more backed up by these countries, I do hope that this will, yeah, that they will consider this, and at least, stop the aggression, and have a ceasefire so that the people can breathe again. On the other hand, of course, you have the Hamas. Um, it's not as if they haven't done anything, or
Sure.
bad things. They are a terrorist organization. They killed a lot of people, innocent people, as well, of course, did the Israeli government. So that's also difficult, of course, because you don't want to negotiate with a terrorist organization.
It's interesting that you say that because, like, I think, especially since like the 9/11 attacks, there's this whole shift in sort of terrorism studies where negotiating with terrorists has become a no-go. Like, it's impossible for people to negotiate with terrorists. They are seen as irrational, and more importantly, negotiating with terrorists legitimizes them. And that's the last thing you want to do. Like, you don't want to acknowledge a terrorist organization. And I think the Israeli government is still very much in that, in the sense that they will not stop until Hamas is destroyed. At least that's their current mandate,
Yeah.
and I don't think that will change unless the government changes of Israel. And I think it's interesting that they're going into these ceasefire negotiations where it's like, how is Israel going to like go about that? Because they're all about destructing and just destroying Hamas as a terrorist organization. Um, and it's interesting to me that they even go into this negotiation because it's such a no-go to do it to negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah, I think that's maybe I think that could be a positive step forward for the Palestinian people, of course, because they are the ones who need the help. And that is a shift, because before, like you said, they would not want to negotiate with a terrorist organization. On the other hand, if you look into history, I'm not sure if I'm quite correct, but in Ireland, for example, there was the IRA, and they were fighting for the Republic of Ireland. It was already established, but the northern of Ireland, they wanted that to be part of the Republic as well.
Mhm.
They were actually fighting against the UK. Also, there the IRA was their terrorist actions were highlighted, but the terrorist actions of for example, the Ulster movement that you could compare to Israel, and the IRA you could compare to Hamas, for example. They were not highlighted in the news because the UK tried to, not to talk much about that, what was happening. And in the end, there were negotiations. The IRA promised not to take up the weapons anymore, to do not do any terrorist actions anymore. And we were in Belfast, and now there's still those national feelings between for the Irish, but um, it's going better and better. Although still sentiments are spoken about that they want to have, Ireland as a whole again. But maybe this is the beginning, these negotiations of, talking about it and making it happen. That, yeah, I mean that they can reach a compromise,
Do
and
you
from
think
that,
that's possible? Because I don't believe so. I think that this whole thing has started so long ago, and with like the Jewish people um recognizing their rights to the country and the Arabs recognizing their rights, it's like like I don't see how they're ever going to reach a compromise. I hope that they'll reach the truce talks, and I do hope that they reach like some sort of ceasefire at least for a little bit, but I don't think you can ever really get a full compromise, not with the ideology of Hamas or the ideology of Israel, both.
it will be very difficult. Oh, of course, it will be very, very difficult. And but I'm hopeful because you say it's taken such a long time already, this conflict. But if you look at, well, I'm getting back to that, the Irish conflict, it was already happening in when William of Orange, actually a Dutch man who helped the British to conquer Ireland, and it was, I mean, I believe in the 7th century or something like that. So that long ago, it's already started the conflict. Now, with the Palestinian conflict and with Israel, it's even in a shorter time. Although I don't know, there were other how you'd say that. The US was involved, the UN was involved, and there were so many interests in that situation that they wanted Israel to succeed because of that they had to have more power in the Middle East, and that is now changing and shifting. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe also, I what you hear now is that the Israeli people are also have demonstrations against this right-winged government. They had it before, before all this started. A lot of people were against, but Netanyahu was, I believe, something he wanted to change about the, how do you say that, the about the law that they you get more power or something. He wanted to change something, and they were against it. But unfortunately, he was able to push things through. Maybe now they get so tired of this war, of this suffering. Also, they are suffering also, the Israeli people, that they say what the right winged government is doing is leading to nothing. Maybe that can just initiate a change. I don't know.
I hope so. I mean, as like you saw with the what Al Jazeera posted on the 30th of March, they did say that the Israelis were, or at least there were protests in front of the Israeli president, for his mandate because they believe that he's obstructing this whole ceasefire um negotiation, especially with regards to the captives and the hostages that Hamas has taken, and trying to get them back into Israel. So I do think that currently, like, there's not much government can hide, especially not in a democracy, from their population anymore, because like everything is recorded on people's phones and stuff and social media. So I think that with that more like openness and more clarity of what's actually going on, the population might become more empathetic towards each other and try and strive for peace and fight against like that obstructive power that Israel or other governments in general have.
Yeah, I do. And maybe because of the shift, of course, what we already said by the US and the UN, that they have enough, that they can exert some pressure uh, at the Israeli government to find that compromise. And hopefully Hamas as well is also thinking about what is happening now. And if they cannot yet have everything about what they want to, what they bring at the negotiations, but that at least when there is a, as I already said, a ceasefire, help that human, how do you say that, organizations that are helping, like the Red Cross or I don't know, that kind of organizations are allowed to enter Gaza. Oh, we're already there, but even more, so that they can have food, that they can try to rebuild the hospital, or at
Mm.
least that there is medical help to help those people.
Yes, because currently, like, I think one of the main issues that Gaza's facing is the fact that there's this blockage from Israel, where Israel is blocking Gaza from the outside world and it's blocking their economy, their
Everything.
like everything. And so, if at least that blockage could like cease to continue, because then, you know, the civilians could get their help and could get the stuff that they need to live, the basic necessities. I think that's like one of the most important things to try and reach. Um, but then, of course, even if you get that, and if you get this ceasefire agreement, and if this all goes through successfully, then there's still this Palestine versus Israel
It is, and
conflict.
so much has happened. Uh, I mean, that is not something that will be solved or forgotten that easily. A lot of people were hurt on both sides, lost a lot of dear family, friends, and I think also the Palestinians, they say, okay, they have this terrorist organization called Hamas, but they had no other option. Nobody was fighting for them. So what could they do? What different? They were already so poor, so uh, desperate, I guess, that, well, just let's have it a go and see where it ends, because we're already at the brink of, almost destruction or something. And what I find so hard to imagine and to believe, that what has happened during the Holocaust, and I don't know if I may address that, because I did not experience this. It's horrible, horrible, horrible. But with that experience, how can you do the same to other people? It's actually what is happening now. It's never, how do you say that you're allowed, because that happened to you. So now you're allowed to do that to other people, because you will not ever letting that happen to your own people again.
Hmm.
you, I find it so hard to imagine that they are doing this.
Yeah, I think we can conclude it by just saying that it's a horrible situation regardless. I mean, both people are hurting each other, but what we've seen in the numbers is that Palestinians are have a lot more casualties than Israelis, and I
They
think
do.
that's something that you can really like see. Um, and I think that sort of asymmetry between the two should be recognized.
Yeah. And I hope for the negotiations that, well, that they arrange for a ceasefire. And of course, there will be many, many, many years to go before they can probably live peacefully together, each in their own uh, maybe country or territory. Um, yeah, a lot of things have happened, but I hope that with the help of the US, because of the power they have and the influence they have, and the UN, that there will be some kind of first agreement, and from there on build towards something better and more consistent. And I think the Israeli government, this right-wing government, they have to go. Will this really be able to happen? I think they will have to go, and hopefully the people of Israel, a lot of them, that they can make this happen with the support of the other countries. I do hope so, for the best of the Palestinians.
Representatives of Hamas, the US and Qatar are in Egypt as part of attempts to agree a 6-week ceasefire in Gaza. But Israel is pushing for a list of hostages still alive in Gaza before it'll send a delegation to the talks. Hamas says Israel must withdraw its forces before there can be a deal on hostages. Pressure for a truce has intensified since Thursday, when at least 112 people were killed as crowds rushed towards an aid convoy in the north of the territory amid Israeli army gunfire.
In summary, it's complicated. With Israel and Palestine pretty much diametrically opposed, it is hard to see the right outcome. Moreover, it is important not to overlook the different stakes of various governments with hidden agendas, such as the United States and its relation with Israel. What Hamas lacks in structural power, they try to make up for with situational power. The organization understood where it lacked influence and military capabilities and supplemented it through terrorism. Both Israel and Hamas use different forms of power, but the result in casualties is asymmetrical. There are many more Palestinian civilian casualties than there are Israeli. But because both parties recognize their power and are not willing to give it up, they are in a headlock. I do believe that a ceasefire is the best first step. It will allow the population some breathing room, and it is one of the easiest objectives to make concessions about. One thing I've learned in my negotiation classes at university is that it's best to start with things you can actually negotiate on. It is very unlikely that either side will compromise. Therefore, I think that the only thing that might result in a change of the situation would be a replacement of the right-winged Israeli government. I heard in a different podcast by Al Jazeera something that I also believe to be true. Hamas is not just an organization, it is an ideology. Even if Israel succeeds in the destruction of the terrorist organization, the Palestinians will still continue to pursue their independence. If the Israeli government becomes less adamant on destroying Hamas and provides the people in Gaza with hope that coexistence is possible, this could slowly result in relationship building. However, even if diplomats agree, as we saw with the Oslo Accords, it will depend on the people. Whether either side will be able to change remains to be seen.
It's staggering how many people in Arabic or English will say ceasefire, ceasefire. I was at Kamal Adwan Hospital last week. That's where children died of malnutrition, and mothers in that ward with paper-thin babies would just... I said, what do you need? Ceasefire, ceasefire. People are pleading for a ceasefire. This is Gaza's last hope.